Arcady, it's really great to have you along as a technology leader. It's terrific to have you on the panel today.
Thank you, James, and thank you, Ahmad, for that overview of the industry. I'm reporting to you live from the surface of Mars. And I know that's a cheeky comment, but for those of you in the San Francisco Bay Area that have looked outside today, I'm sure you thought the same thing. And it just strikes to serve the point that we're trying to make today, which is that electric vehicle adoption, electrification needs to happen quickly. Those of us in the industry understand that it's a mega trend, but it couldn't come soon enough. We are experiencing as a civilization what China has experienced over the last decade to 15 years. And we've seen what's happened there, which is a move towards green energy, a clean economy. And they're effectively the leader in clean energy today. So I hope that days like today in the San Francisco Bay Area really serve to move our agenda forward. So a little bit of background.
Yeah, totally. Thank you, Arcady. I mean, what a day to have a World EV Day when everyone can really see the impact of climate change and the visually see the picture of it's being painted in California. So I think that's super important. So the question we have for you today is, with your work at Freewire, paint us a picture of how cost down and improve user experience benefits EV charging and encourages electric vehicle uptake.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let me give you a quick background on what we do. What Freewire does is we develop EV charging technology to enable ultra-fast charging electric vehicles, but we solve the pain point of the infrastructure behind that charger, right? So what we've done is package energy storage with charging technology and software to effectively be able to deploy ultra-fast chargers using low-power infrastructure. Now, what that does for our customers is obviously reduce the infrastructure cost behind the charger. So instead of paying several $100,000 for the infrastructure behind a charger, our customers pay low tens of thousands of dollars for the infrastructure behind a charger, which serves to increase the IRR that Ahmad was mentioning earlier. So in use cases that we've deployed our charger, which is called the boost charger, because it effectively boosts the power at the grid edge, in those cases, we've seen IRRs as high as 40% over 5 years. That is a game changer for this industry, but more so than increasing the economic equation around charging and making charging actually feasible from a commercial standpoint, what it does is it serves to open up the addressable market for charging, because now we can deploy charging infrastructure in places that would have otherwise been disqualified. Think about it this way, that if you are a retail owner and you own 100 sites, you may have chosen the best 10 to deploy charging, or the 10 that were most commercially viable, the cheapest to deploy that charging infrastructure. You disqualify the other 90 and everyone forgot about it, right? What we are able to do is unlock the other 90 locations, making charging more readily available and accessible for EV drivers, which then promotes our mission of higher EV adoption. Now, I want to talk about a few pitfalls and a few opportunities in this industry that I've noticed. We are still making mistakes as an industry, but we do have a few opportunities that can be game changers. So a couple of mistakes that I believe we're making is things like make-ready infrastructure. There is a push towards having utilities deploy infrastructure underground and with hundreds of millions of dollars allocated towards that. I do not believe that is the right approach. And if you look at the previous quarterly results around these programs, you'll see that they're highly inefficient and the spending is highly out of line with what companies like Freewires and ChargePoints and Voltas and EVgo's and Electrify Americas can achieve through more effective uses of their capital. I do not think make-ready infrastructure is a model that we should see across outside of California, and that's something that we are fighting against. However, there are models that are really working well. The California Energy Commission, for example, in deploying capital towards infrastructure projects, I think is working well. And the California Energy Commission is working on a new program called TERPA, T-E-R-P-A. TERPA will do for EV charging infrastructure what PERPA did for solar several decades ago, in that it incentivizes highly efficient uses of capital so that we can lower rates for all ratepayers, not increase rates for ratepayers, similar to what make-ready programs are doing. So I'm very, very bullish about that, highly supportive of the CEC's goals for making TERPA happen. I also see some opportunities in new investment players coming into the space. We have raised, over the course of 6 years, about $45 million in equity financing for Freewire. And in the early days, that came from the usual players, oil and gas companies like BP. We had investment from ABB, who's arguably one of the leaders in fast charging today, but generally strategic investors are who invested in Freewire. What we're seeing now is a completely different trend. We're seeing an influx of private equity and infrastructure funds into the space. And that marks a new milestone for EV charging. That means that infrastructure players, private equity players that have much lower risk profiles than some of the corporate strategics are starting to understand that IRR can be generated across large swaths of charging infrastructure. They see the gold rush that is happening in EV charging plainly, and they are coming into the space, and that's really exciting. And the entire investment thesis that I've seen happening across the space follows the journey of the electric vehicle customer and the customer that buys charging infrastructure. So in the early days when charging was still kind of an unknown, almost like a test case, that was 5-6 years ago when Google deployed charging stations across their campus, when you saw a few charging stations deployed with municipal fleets, you saw mostly corporate strategic investors invest. Now that they're being deployed in large swaths across public, retail, fleet, network operators, the private equity players are just jumping in, and they're jumping in quickly. Right. And so what I see happening over the next few years is not yet the big banks coming in, and maybe Michael can talk about that from the Wells Fargo perspective, but I see some of the more risk-seeking private equity players just really jumping into the space and putting huge swaths of capital, and I'm talking about hundreds of millions to low billions of dollars of capital in chunks into EV charging infrastructure to be deployed in locations with high utilization. What I see happening, yeah.
Thank you. Sorry, thank you. We just run out of a little bit of time there, but we do have a question, and I've actually had 2 or 3 people send it to me. Can you explain a little bit more about, you made some comments about Make Ready. Why do you think it's not so good? What's the, you have some negative thoughts about it, or, perhaps what are the improvements that could be made?
Sure. Make Ready programs, the concept of them is that you're paying for the utility to pull power to locations, right? So the utility pays for everything up to the stub, or where the power comes out of the ground, and then you have others place charging infrastructure on top. That is not incentivizing efficient use of utility infrastructure. There are better ways to deploy charging. There are ways to deploy charging where you can have a battery integrated approach similar to the way Freewire does, where you're actually smoothing the consumption curve, right? There are ways to provide mobile charging infrastructure. There are ways to provide solar charging similar to the way companies like EV Arc does. So there are ways to more efficiently use the existing infrastructure. This EV charging at scale will not work if we simply put copper in the ground. There is too much demand that is going to happen on the utility infrastructure. You are going to need larger peaker plants behind all of that infrastructure. You're going to need to scale up everything behind it, and that is completely cost ineffective. Utilities are also not necessarily the best stewards of that capital. The utilities are incentivized to put infrastructure in the ground and make a return on it. We need to not do that, and we need to make sure that charging is available anywhere consumers want in the most cost-effective way. So I don't believe in make-ready infrastructure. I think it was great in the early days to just spur on initial investments to lower the cost, but I think there's a better way to lower costs for all ratepayers.
Thank you, Arcady. Really appreciate your comments and the extra comments on Make Ready right there. What we're going to do now is we're going to have some panelist questions. So what will happen is I'll be I'll be introducing the panelist and the person that they're asking to, and they're going to ask that question as we move forward. I know Michael has a question for Arcady. Can you, Michael, ask Arcady that question, please?
Sure, yeah, I was just wondering, Arcady, what you kind of think are some of the high-level numbers, going back to your discussion, that you think are needed, whether it's in California or United States, or however you want to frame it. You know, that demand play, I think, is really interesting. A little chicken and the egg, right, that we face in this industry as any emerging technology. So, you know, what do you think are some of the numbers that are needed?
Yeah, I think the best source for those numbers comes from McKinsey. McKinsey put out a great kind of article last year. Charging Ahead is the title, and they estimate that by 2025, in the U.S., we will need about 6 million chargers across the U.S., and and then by 2030, we'll need about 13 million chargers across the U.S. That's a cumulative spend of $11 billion in the U.S. on charging equipment alone, not including the cost of energy or some of the other kind of soft costs around that industry. If you look across the US, China, and EU, ignoring all other smaller regions, they estimate that we'll need about, let's see, 45 million chargers across the US, the EU, and China, and we'll need to spend about $50 billion cumulative by 2030 on charging infrastructure. So it's a huge amount of spend, right? It's a massive opportunity for any investor coming in the space. But I think particularly it's a big opportunity for the private equity part of the space. And then later on, once the risk, I think, decreases, I think the more traditional banks like Wells Fargo.
Thanks, Arcady. Much appreciated. Before we finish up our time today, I'd just like every panelist here just to give perhaps their one sentence thought on what the direction is for electric vehicles and their future investment, and a key message that you would like to leave our audience as we take away. Arcady, what's your one sentence thought you'd like to leave everyone with?
Look to Europe. 20% of stimulus spending as part of the COVID pandemic went towards clean energy across the European Union. In the US, that was 1.1%. Europe has 8% penetration of new vehicles that are electric. The US is hovering around 1 to 2%. Look to Europe to see what's happening next. And that, by the way, answers a question about the oil and gas majors in the US that was asked earlier. You have oil and gas majors in Europe, much more forward thinking. So we need to follow that example, follow that model.